Welcome to Keep What You Earn, your judgment and jargon-free zone for entrepreneurs of all levels. Get ready to learn how to scale your business, save money in taxes, and create a business that grows your wealth. If it feels like the financial side of business is like eating your vegetables, well then think of this podcast as the ranch dressing to make the process a little more enjoyable. My name is Shannon Weinstein. I'm a CPA and business owner on a mission to simplify money and empower others through knowledge. I hope this episode inspires you to take action, but remember that the information we share is for educational purposes only and is not individual tax advice. Now that we got that out of the way, let's start the show. I pretty much think it's human nature to not really think about the negative things that could happen in the future and to not really face what could be our fate. And it's not to say that we have to think about things that are morbid or that are, down and act like Eeyore all the time, right? And be pessimistic. But there is some responsibility in planning for the future and what that holds for us, because we're not going to live forever and we're not going to be in capacity to make decisions forever. And our business won't last forever and ever and ever. So we have to really be thinking about what are the plans that we want to have? How do we want to handle things? And who are the people that we want around us when that happens? So I'm really excited to offer some knowledge today about estate planning with my friend, client, and attorney, Clara Delgado Rossell. She's the principal attorney and founder of Providence Legal, PA. She has a Master of Laws in Taxation and is licensed to practice law in Florida and Texas. Before she launched her solo practice in South Florida, she clerked for the Honorable Peter J. Bush at the San Francisco Probate Court and earned her stripes servicing high net worth individuals at a boutique estate planning firm in Central Florida. Her current practice focuses on helping clients from all walks of life with their estate planning, asset protection, trust, and probate administration. Today on the show, we're going to unpack why all this stuff is really not as complicated as you think it is, why anyone can have access to estate planning, and how the simplest actions can really set a positive course for your future when it comes to protecting your assets, no matter how big or small, and how you can plan accordingly to make sure your loved ones are taken care of. Do not miss this episode, guys. Make sure you save it, grab a notebook, take some notes, and take some action with what you learn in today's episode with Clara. Hey, Clara, welcome to the show.
Hi, Shannon. Nice to be here. Hi, everybody.
Could you just say hello to everyone and let them know who you are?
Hi, guys. My name is Clara. I am an estate planning lawyer and a client of Shannon's, actually. She helped my business out a little bit as well. And I'm based out of Miami, got into estate planning. It seems like a lifetime ago, but I actually was a litigator in my former life.
Okay. What got you into estate planning? Like what got you passionate about that type of law practice?
So I mentioned I was a litigator. I was at a law school. I did employment law. So litigated, fought the good fight, or so I thought, and then got kind of disillusioned with all of that. And I'd always been good at math and science. So I was like, okay, how can I sort of incorporate math or science into my law degree, right? And I was in California at the time. I had moved with my partner and I wasn't admitted to the bar there. So I started working with a legal recruiter and I started seeing all of these estate planning law firms out there and people with tax LLMs who really knew their way around numbers. And I was like, wow, this is a brave new world. When I went to law school, we were not encouraged to really think outside of litigation practice. Transactional was sort of just something you ended up doing somehow, right? Usually if you went in-house. And I ended up enrolling in a tax LLM program in San Francisco. And a few years later, here I am.
And what's an LLM for those listening who may not know?
That's a great question. So a law degree is a JD, it's a Juris Doctorate, and an LLM is just a master's of laws in a specific area. Then in my case, it would have been tax.
Got it. Okay, cool. So when it comes to estate planning, I'm sure you've seen a ton of stories or heard stories about the importance of estate planning. Like, let me just start with what is estate planning and what can happen if you do or don't do it?
So estate planning in a nutshell really is just setting yourself up to carry out the wishes for your things, right? In some point in the future. That can be incapacity typically before someone is actually deceased, right? Statistics nowadays are a little bit jaw dropping in terms of how many of us can expect to have some form of like dementia or Alzheimer's or temporary or permanent incapacity. So that's kind of the first piece. And the second piece, obviously, everybody thinks about estate planning as being like death planning. That's like half of it. But yeah, estate planning, if you do not do your own planning, your state does it for you. Every state is different in terms of what it dictates. It's called intestacy succession. But essentially, in places like Florida, a lot of deference is given to your surviving spouse, right? And surviving spouse means anyone that you were married to at the time of your incapacity or death, whether or not you were living with the person, whether or not you were separated from the person. So that's a little jarring for most people to say, okay, well, 100% of my estate is going to go to my spouse from whom I was estranged. Yeah, that's exactly what happens when you do not fill in the blanks yourself. The state does it for you. And in the case of blended families, it can be a little bit different, right? If we're talking a Brady Bunch scenario, of course, a spouse that has their own set of kids isn't going to get 100% of your estate, but they're likely going to get 50% of it if you don't do planning on your own.
Okay. And what have you seen before in your clients or in stories you've heard about? I know there's tons of stuff in the media too about this where, you know, this can go sideways if it's not done properly and the right steps aren't taken soon enough.
Yeah, 1,000%. And I see this a lot in Miami, especially because I'm Hispanic. And from a cultural perspective, we rely a lot on family, right? Oh, well, I don't have to do anything. My family knows exactly what I want. They know exactly what to do. That's fine. And that might be true. But then you come up against financial institutions who have nothing in writing, and they're not going to let your spouse do whatever they want to do with a bank account that their name isn't on, let's say, or your kids. No matter whether, they really are trying to do the best thing for you, there are ways legally to memorialize that authority. And if you don't do that, financial institutions aren't going to care. I mean, if you're incapacitated, they're looking to, and I'm sorry to curse, but to cover their ass. And that's
Oh yeah. And
logical,
don't
right?
worry about this show. I've said way worse things on this show before. Do not worry about cursing on this show. We had that little E for a reason.
Yeah. And listen, attorneys are experts at CYA, and every
Mm-hmm.
bank has a legal department, right? So there are restrictions on what they can do. And same for medical providers, right? If we're talking about estate planning as medical directives, yeah, I mean, your kids can't just go to the hospital and say, I'm so and so's kid. It might give them temporary authority, but if something really happens where there's a conflict between siblings who want different things for a parent, or a spouse having a conflict with a parent, we saw that in Florida. There's a really famous case that involved a woman by the name of Terry Schiavo. And there was litigation, protracted litigation between her spouse and her parents about what was going to happen. And honestly, I don't think anyone really wants that. The expectation sometimes, though, is just that it'll get taken care of somehow. Well, there's no magic wand. You have the magic wand. And if you don't use it, that's when things tend to go awry. And another thing, too, is people get sold on estate planning, things like trusts. Those are phenomenal vehicles when they're used well and when they're funded properly. But we see this all the time, that clients create these trusts, or they have created these trusts in the past, and they never funded them. That's creating it is half the battle. Putting things into it is the second piece of the puzzle, right? And if you don't do that second piece, your trust isn't going to be any good.
Yeah. It's like retirement accounts. It's like you can open it, but you got to put something in it because that's the purpose of it.
100%. And that's sort of what happened in Michael Jackson's case. We all kind of were privy to what happened when that estate planning went wrong, right? Everything ended up in probate court. Probate court is an open forum. It's public. So everybody gets to see your dirty laundry, as opposed to the intention, right? When you set up a trust, it's meant to be private. It's meant to be between your estate, your lawyer, whatever, and your family.
Yeah. And the goal is to have as little go to probate as possible, right? My fundamental understanding of it and tell me if I'm wrong, and kind of, you can kind of fill in the blanks for me. Based on my experience with my father's passing and my father-in-law, this is what I've learned about the process, which again, I only learned about because this happened. And I did not
Mhm.
know this before this happened. And this was so important. Was when my dad passed away, we were talking about certain things going to probate that shouldn't have. And it was this long, like 6 to 9 month process, maybe even a year or longer, to distribute certain assets or to allocate what was going to go where and who was going to be assigned it. And there were a lot of things that were really easy and fast. Like if my dad put me on an LLC or on an account or on as a joint holder on certain things, it was basically like, he passed away. That is now yours. No question. The next day you can go do what you need to go do and no hassle. But there was a lot of stuff that went through the probate process that basically took a long time to determine who had the right to what. And even though it was in the wishes and it was laid out, it still had to go through a process. Is that kind of how it works? Like it's basically the unclaimed, in a sense, or unallocated stuff that wasn't planned before the passing.
Yeah, so it actually can be two things. And estate planning, I mentioned this in an email to you once. It's not
Yeah.
alchemy, right? It's
Yeah.
you put in certain ingredients and you get a certain outcome. So we typically look at things as being in one of three categories, right? First category, beneficiary designations. People do this all the time. It's the simplest form of estate planning. You designate beneficiaries on your retirement accounts. You can typically designate beneficiaries even on checking and savings accounts. Ask your bank. They'll tell you, yeah, we have a POD, pay on death, or TOD, transfer on death designation. And that is the simplest form of estate planning. So for people who say, oh, I don't have an estate, but you've got $40,000 in a checking or savings account and $10,000 in a checking account, that's something to somebody. So that's kind of the first bucket. The second bucket is the trust bucket. If you've created a trust and you've funded it appropriately, that bucket is full. Anything that doesn't meet either of those two criteria, that's not either part of the trust and that doesn't have a beneficiary designation, that is typically what ends up in probate. But probate isn't always the default. People who create wills, that those assets will necessarily go through probate if they don't have a trust, right? And even when we have a trust as a safety net, we always create something called a pour over will that essentially takes whatever assets were inadvertently left out of that trust and just dumps them into that trust bucket. And you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the sticking points of probate, and probate does sometimes have a validity, right? There's sometimes a perk to going through probate because it is court supervised, right? So if there's something that's really contentious and you want an arbiter, you want a judge to be overseeing it, probate might not be such a bad idea. But for most people that don't have a ton of complications, they just want their assets to go to their intended beneficiaries as quickly and easily as possible. Probate is not the thing, right? In a formal probate administration, and there's sometimes different avenues based on the amount of money that we're talking about. But yeah, probate administration takes at least 6 months if everything is streamlined and easy. And we have financial institutions who, by the way, are sort of the bane of my existence. And I apologize for those listeners out there who work for banks or brokerage firms, but they really do create quite a bit of delay. And the creditor process in a probate administration is lengthy as well. So we have to notice creditors and allow them to file claims. And in Florida, the legislature has said, well, that has to take at least 90 days. So they have a 90-day window in which to file these claims, and the estate has to remain open, right? Taxes also, unfortunately, something that delays a probate or can delay a probate when, somebody has unfiled tax returns or has a tax return that's not terribly easy, right? There's lots of running around that has to be done by the person in charge of the administration. That's usually a personal representative or an executor. It's different terminology again in different states. But yeah, it's a lot of work. And unfortunately, if you allow the default that intestate probate administration, the person who's administering your estate might not be the best person to be doing that.
Right. And so you mentioned too, like there's this hesitation for people to do estate planning. Cause like, by the way, estate planning sounds like an advanced thing. Like if you told me, oh, you need to go do estate planning, I'm like, that sounds like I have to go dress up and go to an office and like have an appointment and go through this formal process. But you just kind of broke down that estate planning is as simple as logging in and setting up a beneficiary. Estate planning is as simple as giving thought to what will happen to this and actually setting up the path and directing what will happen. And it can be super simple. So, aside from those kind of simple things, which I know everyone listening can go do right now today at their financial institutions, taking stock of what you have in your assets and just saying, do I have a beneficiary for all this stuff that I've already identified? And who is it currently? Have you updated it? Because you got to make sure, because you probably set it up in your 401k when you were in your 20s, and who knows who that was that you set it up with. Just make sure that it's up to date. And also, what do you recommend for folks who maybe are business owners who are thinking, oh, I have money in the bank and it hadn't really occurred to me? I mean, for one, there's business continuity planning, which we're going to tackle in another episode of like what will happen when, right? But let's say there is something happens to the owner or to a shareholder and they may not have estate planning in place, right? There's a ton that can go sideways with that, especially if the family doesn't truly know what's going on with the business or how that's working. When do you think, especially those listening who are business owners, when do you think they should start planning and start having these types of discussions? Because I know that typically they happen, I mean, in my family, they happen when diagnoses happen, because that was when things started to come into clarity that this was a possible outcome. But in reality, this is always a possible outcome. So is it ever too soon to do estate planning?
No, I would say absolutely not. I mean, even before my mom passed away 5 years ago, and before her passing, I really had very little to my name, right? I knew that eventually my parents would pass and I would have somewhat of an inheritance. But I mean, the wise thing to do is really to take stock of what you have. And even if it's as simple as going down to your bank and, designating someone to be the custodian of those assets, designating a beneficiary, that's pretty simple to do even when you have nothing. But when folks like you and I, when we have a business, things get a little bit more complicated because there's no one in my family that could run my firm, right? There's probably very few people in your family or even in your group of friends, Shannon, who could run your business, right?
Right.
So the purpose in part of estate planning when you become an entrepreneur is really business succession planning, right? Because you can leave the ownership interest to somebody, right? The right to receive some profit, some financial gain. But you also need to think about who's going to be running the day to day. Is this going to be a business that gets wound up, that gets closed and dissolved when I die? Or do I want this to live on? Do I want this to be my legacy? And a lot of business owners, we kind of fall into the latter category, right? We've amassed this goodwill through our years of practice, through our years of experience. And it would be really sad to watch that just kind of dissipate and die because we didn't think to appoint a key employee as the person to run that. Right. Or we didn't appoint, in my case, for example, the Florida bar requires us to have someone that clients can go to if we pass or if something should happen to us and they can't get in touch with us. Why? Because we have client files that are important. We have documents that are important. So, I think that can be said for just about any business, right? We have a shoe repair place that went out of business across the street from my partner's house. And there was a barrage of messaging on social media and on Google about how this man who something must have happened to, he had everyone's shoes. And in a city like Miami, those shoes were probably pretty valuable if they were taking them to be repaired. So I don't know. I mean, it sounds really silly, but there's just a lot that you can do even when you have very little to give yourself some peace of mind and frankly, to give your family some peace of mind, because we have folks all the time calling and saying, oh, well, so-and-so had a business, real estate investments, for example, and we don't know what to do with them. We're in a down market. Do we sell them now or who do we hire to run this? Well,
Yeah.
it probably would have been easier if the person initially running it had really stopped to think about who would be a good person to be at the helm of the ship.
Yeah.
Um,
Or if something should happen to me, go do this with it, knowing kind of what was going to happen. And the other part, what you mentioned too, is like, it doesn't matter how much you have, because let's say I were to go to my bank and say anything in this checking account, the beneficiary will be this person or these people or this, because you can do like percentage allocations of beneficiary.
that's-
Yeah.
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So you can set up your own custom way of setting that up. And like, it doesn't matter how much is in the account, it's still the directive. So you can just keep pouring more into that account, knowing that no matter what is in there will be split X, Y, and Z ways just from you taking that one action of setting that up.
And you made a really good point about, periodically revising things. We had someone whose trust administration and ultimately a probate administration was required, but they had left their former spouse as the beneficiary of their life insurance policies. And it's interesting because when they divorced that prior spouse, it was a really contentious divorce. And the MSA, the marital settlement agreement, which is basically the divorce decree, said this person got nothing. But because the policy was taken out in a state where that wouldn't have been valid, all sorts of chaos ensued. And it's funny because not only did this prior spouse get all of that money, and I want to say it was like over $1 million,
Wow.
the estate, so the family was paying the tax burden of that, right? Because this was an estate that was over the estate tax threshold. That's like another concept for another day, but it was basically subject to US inheritance tax. And that tax is 40% once you get above 12 million and change. So it was, yeah, it was a really bitter pill to swallow for the family, and really unfortunate. And frankly, it could have all been avoided if the person, and frankly, in this case, I think probably the divorce attorney had thought to say, hey, you have all these life insurance policies. Let's maybe take a look at the beneficiaries, and they're up to date.
And of course, we can't go through any like specific tax advice or anything on the show. You know that that's what I typically say.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts and recommendations though on, I'm just curious, the end of life planning or incapacitated planning, right? To say maybe like for end of life planning, for example, does it make sense to start putting things in other people's names while you're alive to minimize the amount of the estate sort of allocations that are going to happen? Have you seen that happen? And is that in any way beneficial? Have you seen?
It makes sense sometimes. So, going back to that concept of the estate tax, once an individual gets above the $12 million mark, they're going to be subject to that estate tax, right? It's a little bit different if you're married because the spouses can kind of couple up and then get the 24 million, actually closer to 13 million in that case. But yeah, I mean it's a little bit complicated. Usually there's a tax disincentive to make lifetime gifts, right? There's an annual gift that you're allowed to make to any individual. It's currently $16,000. It changes every year. It gets adjusted for inflation. So typically my advice to a client who's not this ultra high net worth person and subject to estate tax is going to be, let's stay under that threshold, right? If you want to give, your son $16,000 a year, and then maybe you want to give them more than that, give another $16,000 to their spouse, or give another $16,000. Actually, that might be running afoul of UTMA, but give another $15,000 to their minor child, right?
Right.
Those are all gifts that are permissible, and they don't actually start counting against you for inheritance tax purposes,
Got it.
right? But in the current state that we're in with estate taxes, it's actually a little bit tricky, right? Because this inheritance tax, it's at a record high right now. Going back like 5 years ago, we were looking at a much lower exemption amount. So the amount that you're allowed to give your heirs when you die, or your beneficiaries when you die, was much, much lower. It was like 6-7 million. And in 2025, that current exemption, that $12.5 million exemption per person, is supposed to go away. unless the legislature does something about it. And this is the funny thing about tax and politics is they tend to go kind of hand in hand. Most people are saying, well, Democrats are currently, reigning in, well, not so much in the legislature, I guess, but, the likelihood that the estate tax exemption is going to be allowed to go down really depends on policy, right? It really depends on the legislature and what your senators and what your congressmen are going to do. Now, part of effective planning, right, is to say, well, let's maybe plan for every eventuality, right? So in
Yeah.
that case, if we have someone who has $25 million, we're probably going to recommend that they do some lifetime gifting, maybe to move some assets out of their taxable estate and, maybe recommend some other kind of more sophisticated planning, things like irrevocable life insurance trusts are also vehicles that get some money out of your taxable estate so that it's not subject to that inheritance tax when you eventually pass. For married folks, the options are a little bit more varied and typically a little bit more palatable because we can do things like spousal trusts where there's an exchange of assets. You still get to reap the benefits, right? But you've essentially frozen the value of assets so that appreciation is not later subject to inheritance tax. So it can get pretty granular and pretty nuanced, but for the most part, there's things that everybody can do that benefit them from a tax perspective by planning for them rather than just saying, I'm going to quit claim this property to so-and-so during my lifetime. Because then you're not just penalizing yourself, you're actually penalizing the other person as well. Shannon, you can probably speak to this much better than I can, but they're essentially getting your tax basis in property and they're going to have to pay a whole lot of capital gains if that property has appreciated when they eventually sell. Then
Yes. That's a big one is like, hey, mom and dad, buy property and don't give it to me.
Yeah.
That is one great way to pass on legacy wealth. And I'll explain that in a second. But this really kind of enhances the argument of doing estate planning with a lawyer who's experienced in this, like you, but also somebody who knows the tax code, especially your state taxes too, where they can work together to make sure the optimal outcome. Because sometimes what is logically the thing you want to do in your wishes can cause adverse tax effects that you're not aware of. Yeah. And that's a really important thing is like, I think a lot of lawyers, right, you'll take the directives from the people and what their wishes are and what they want. But unless you have a specialty and you know the tax impact and can kind of, I think the collaboration is where the optimal value is when you can have somebody who's kind of a tax expert and with the estate planning and kind of go, okay, well, what will happen if, or what direction is this heading in? Like you said, with the exemptions and the law, how is this going to change? But to your point before about the property, so there's this thing called step-up basis, guys, where this actually can happen. This actually happened to my husband when his dad passed away, right? So he owned a piece of property. And what happened was he was asking me, for example, should I just put this in Jason's name before I pass? And I said, no, absolutely, because it's like a reset button on the prices, guys. So what happens is if he passed away, what ends up happening is my husband would acquire the property at the value it was at on the date of death, as though he bought it at that price point. So, but if you give it to them during the lifetime, and I'm paraphrasing this and really summing it up, but if you give it to them during the lifetime, you're going to take their cost basis. So if he bought it for $100,000 and now it's worth $1 million, and then you sell it for 1.2, it's like, you don't want that gain from the 100 to the million point. You want the gain from the million to the 1.2. You just want to pay tax on that little bit. And that's what it enables it for you to do is hit reset and lock in your cost basis at the point that the person died. And that is a really, really killer strategy for tax-free wealth and tax-free building of wealth, because technically no one ever paid taxes on that gross.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a capital gains mitigation strategy. And frankly, it's one of the benefits that this country has, right? I mean, my family is mostly in Spain. My dad and I are the black sheep. And you do not get to avail yourself of things like that in Spain. This is one of the beautiful things about the US tax code, and really something it does to help everybody across the board. I mean, there's very few things that are as egalitarian as this tax basis step up. So
Yeah.
yeah, and to your point about hiring an attorney that has a background in tax to do your estate planning, that is a huge morsel of truth there, because there are plenty of estate planning attorneys who are kind of general practitioners and dabble. This is not the area that you want to dabble in. I mean,
Yeah. You
there's
don't want the generalist in this area.
yeah, and that's not to, that's not to badmouth other attorneys. I'm sure there's plenty of folks who maybe don't have a tax LLM and know their way around estate taxes because they've devoted some time to learning it. But as a general rule, I do encourage your listeners to ask their estate planning attorney, like, do you know much about tax? Can you walk me through the tax benefits or tax consequences of doing the things that we're doing? Because I've seen plenty of attorneys' names on these quitclaim deeds. Somebody prepared that, and somebody who clearly either wasn't doing the right thing or didn't know that they weren't doing the right thing.
Yeah. And even if they can't, even if they say, that they're not specialized in that area, again, don't not work with them, but maybe say, do you know someone who you can recommend to collaborate with who will have a really deep understanding of the tax impact? Or do you have somebody you recommend that you work well with? Because I actually think there's immense value in two professionals as well, or at least having someone who knows both sides and is well experienced, but also someone who can just make sure that they're looking out for the best interests of the client from multiple different angles and dimensions.
Yeah, 100%. And no one's an expert in everything, right? My tax LLM, I know a lot about transfer tax, about what happens when you die and when you transfer property. I don't know that much about income tax. This is where I rely on my client's tax preparer to say, okay, listen, we've got this kind of corporate strategy, or we've got this kind of corporate entity to deal with. How can we do some tax mitigation, and in conjunction, take care of this business succession plan or do this buy sell agreement so that, everything makes sense. But yeah, I absolutely, I think two professionals working together are definitely better than one, to the extent that they're able to communicate effectively, right?
That's always the big extent in the
Yeah.
if. Yeah. I love nothing more than sitting with a lawyer and doing a whiteboard session about a client and actually problem solving together. But you'd be surprised, guys, how many don't really want to do that or just like to not play in the sandbox with others. So you have to really find some people who are willing to communicate and collaborate.
And I feel the same way about some financial advisors, right? There's financial advisors who are phenomenal resources, who are enrolled agents or who have, who are CPAs, and they know a tremendous amount about the tax laws. So definitely leverage your team. I mean, I guess this is like ubiquitous advice, right? It kind of applies to all areas of life. But yeah, definitely check what one person is doing, and maybe run it past a second person, because honestly, any estate planning attorney who's not willing to play with others is not worth your time.
I would completely agree. Clara, so if folks want to learn more about estate planning or if they want to work with an estate planning attorney, what is your advice and how can people get in touch with you if they're able to utilize you? Because I know you have some type of state regulation, right? Like you're limited to certain geographies. So can you just explain that and who you work with, how people can get in touch with you, or what you recommend?
So, first and foremost, every state is different, right? I'm licensed in Florida and I'm licensed in Texas. I'm not licensed in any other jurisdiction. So, unfortunately, as much as I might like to help someone who's living in Massachusetts, we'd have to rope in outside counsel to tackle like specific issues in another jurisdiction, even folks with like property in other jurisdictions. But a really good resource is always the state bar in whatever jurisdiction you are in. So, the Florida bar is able to refer you to attorneys. They have a referral service. And, obviously social media, I don't know how effective it is at finding attorneys for you, but running a quick Google search or going through platforms like Martindale Hubble, all of these platforms are great for information gathering. And typically attorneys, myself included, offer 30-minute intro calls for free of charge. So, to the extent that you find someone who comes recommended by peers or family members, 100% go with the person that they trust. It's typically word of mouth referrals are the best, especially if they've worked with your family before and they know what the family has going on in terms of financial assets. But yeah, look online, look wherever it is that you would look to find any professional, really, and just start reaching out. And I think it's always a good rule of thumb to reach out to a couple of different people before you settle on someone, because oftentimes you gel better with one professional or another. And that's totally subjective. Somebody could have like stellar credentials on paper and they're just a dud and you don't want to work with them because they make your, eyes glaze over.
Yeah, you have to enjoy the process too. Like it's really it's equal parts like the knowledge and the experience, because we had a great estate planning attorney in Massachusetts when my dad passed. And if she wasn't so helpful and nurturing and positive and just like really clear about what we had to go do and like willing to teach us along the way, it would have been a miserable experience. Now, it was a long experience, but it could have been way worse if we felt like we were being lectured at or that we were, stupid for asking a question, things like that. That just can completely make or break it.
Yeah, I think you hit on something really important there. Any estate planner that like hoards their knowledge and isn't willing to share with you and to teach you and to, like bring up that whiteboard and draw diagrams so that, you have that light bulb moment, that's the goal, right? You should really be understanding what your estate planner is telling you. They're difficult concepts oftentimes, but if someone really is invested in your planning, in your livelihood, right, they're going to do what it takes to get you to understand it. I mean, we have draft reviews sometimes that take 3 hours because we're going through every single provision and saying, this is what this says in layman's terms. And is this consistent with what you want? Does this make sense for you? So, it's really important to do your homework, as with just about everything in life. And it's not going to be, super, super easy. It's going to be a little bit time consuming to even just sit down with a questionnaire that your estate planner might give you and go through the motions, right, of writing down, well, what are my assets? Who am I thinking about to be my personal representative or my trustee, or who's going to be making medical decisions for you? Maybe there's some conflict in your mind. Maybe there's some conflict with your spouse, even like dedicating or designating guardians for your minor kids. That's a huge point of contention with most couples. Talk it out. Your estate planning attorney can be a voice of reason and can be a little bit of an arbiter there too. So part psychologist as well. But yeah, in terms of getting in touch with estate planning attorneys, it really shouldn't be hard. And, we can be reached if you're in Florida at our office. We're in the Gables. We, have a pretty phenomenal website where you can book that free consultation online even. You don't even have to call our office. I know some people are, anxiety ridden about even just making the initial call.
Yeah, I'm one of those people too. I hate making phone calls to businesses I've never talked to or people I've never talked to. I'm like, what do I say? What do I do? You have like that frozen. So that's really cool that you have that. And we'll be sure to link that in the show notes too, Clara.
Yeah, great.
Awesome. Thank you so much for hopping on the show today. Really appreciate this conversation. I hope you guys learned a lot. If you could, please share a takeaway that you had, or let us know that you're going to go take action with something you learned in today's episode. Tag us on social media at Keep What You Earn, and we'll be sure to share it with Clara as well. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thanks, Shannon.
If you're an entrepreneur who's just starting out, it can be overwhelming to think about all the responsibilities you have when it comes to financial management and taxes. Even if you've been binging this podcast, implementing all of it can be really stressful if you don't have a clear list of action steps and know exactly what you should be doing right now. Luckily, we organized all of this for you in the Business Financial Quick Starter. This is your one-stop shop for beginning steps of entrepreneurship so you can build your business confidently from day one. This is not me teaching accounting, no way. It's a specific set of essential action steps to save you a lot of time, money, and headaches as you embark on your own entrepreneurship journey. We cover everything from setting up your business bank account all the way through avoiding a surprise tax bill. Now, as a podcast listener, you get 10% off with code KEEPWHATYOUEARN, all one word. So dive in now and access your business financial quick starter. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review on your podcast platform. This small action goes a long way for podcasters to get our message heard by more business owners just like you. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to information about our guests and ways to get in touch with me. We'll see you on the next episode.